She was 6 years old when the quiet routine of her daily life began to change in ways she could not fully understand yet. Living with her parents in a modest home where music was always present but never forced. A place where the piano stood near a window and caught the morning light, and where she liked to sit on the bench with her feet not quite reaching the floor, touching the keys with curiosity rather than ambition. Her parents noticed early that she listened differently from other children, not only hearing sounds but feeling them, reacting with a seriousness that seemed older than her age. And when music played in the house, she often stopped whatever she was doing and stood still as if she were trying to remember something important. They never pushed her toward performance. Instead, they allowed her to explore freely, letting her play simple melodies, repeating phrases she liked, smiling when she made mistakes and starting again without frustration. Her first encounters with the piano were not about discipline or practice schedules. They were about stories and images. Because she imagined scenes while she played, small inner movies where characters walked and laughed and felt shy or brave, and the piano became her way of giving those scenes a voice. When she discovered the music from the film Amélie Poulain, it happened by accident. A television left on in the background while her parents prepared dinner, and the sound of the piano reached her ears from another room, light and playful but also quietly sad. And she walked closer until she stood in front of the screen, watching without fully understanding the story but feeling deeply connected to the sound. She asked her mother what that music was, and when she heard the name she repeated it carefully, as if it were something delicate that could break if said too loudly. From that day she asked to hear the music again and again, and soon she wanted to try playing it herself, not knowing that it was considered difficult or famous, only knowing that it made her feel something she could not explain. Her parents found the sheet music and placed it on the stand, expecting her to struggle and lose interest. But instead she approached it slowly, reading the notes with concentration, taking her time, repeating small sections until they felt right under her fingers. She did not play it perfectly, but she played it honestly, and even in the early attempts there was a sense of understanding that surprised those who listened. Her piano teacher noticed this too, a woman who had taught many children and knew the difference between talent and sensitivity, and she saw in this young girl a rare combination of focus and imagination. As weeks passed, the music became part of her daily routine, not as a task but as a companion, and she spoke about it as if it were a friend, telling her parents how certain parts felt like running and others felt like hiding, how some notes sounded like smiling and others like thinking quietly. When the opportunity to audition for a televised competition for young musicians appeared, her parents hesitated, worried about pressure and exposure. But the girl herself showed calm interest rather than excitement or fear, saying simply that she would like to play the music there too. They explained that it would mean playing in front of many people and cameras, and she listened carefully before nodding, trusting them and trusting the piano. The selection process was long and unfamiliar, filled with waiting rooms and soft voices, but she remained herself throughout, sitting on chairs too big for her, swinging her legs, holding her music close. And when it was her turn to play, she walked to the piano with the same quiet confidence she had at home. Those who listened felt something shift in the room, not because of technical perfection, but because of the way she told the story through sound. And when she finished, there was a pause that felt full rather than empty. She did not bow dramatically or seek applause. She simply looked toward her parents with a small smile, as if checking whether she had said what she wanted to say. Being chosen to move forward in the competition brought new experiences, rehearsals under bright lights, meeting other young musicians, hearing instruments she had only seen in pictures, and learning to wait patiently while others played. She watched closely, absorbing everything, not comparing herself but learning from the atmosphere. And when asked how she felt, she often said she was happy to listen. As the semi-final approached, the focus intensified, producers and coaches discussing details, reminding her of timing and camera angles. But she stayed grounded, returning to the piano whenever she could, closing her eyes, finding the same inner images that had guided her from the beginning. On the day of the second semi-final, the environment was larger and louder than anything she had experienced. The stage wide and bright, the audience filling the space with movement and whispers. And yet when she sat at the piano, the world narrowed to the familiar shape of the keys. Her feet still did not touch the floor, and someone adjusted the bench for her, a small gesture that reminded everyone of her age. But when her hands lifted and hovered over the keyboard, there was a collective sense that something meaningful was about to happen. She took a breath, not as a performance trick but as a natural pause, and began to play. The opening notes of Amélie Poulain flowed gently, and with them came a feeling of intimacy, as if she were sharing a personal secret with each person in the room, her touch light but sure, her timing guided by emotion rather than calculation. She leaned slightly into the music, her expression focused yet soft, and the melody unfolded with clarity, each phrase connected to the next like a conversation that did not need words. The audience listened closely, some leaning forward, others closing their eyes, and even those who knew the piece well felt they were hearing it anew through her perspective. As she continued, there were small imperfections, notes that were slightly softer or stronger than expected, but they did not distract, they added humanity, reminding everyone that this was a child expressing something real rather than a machine reproducing sound. Her interpretation carried innocence without being naive, depth without being heavy, and the contrast created a powerful effect. Judges watched carefully, their expressions shifting from professional assessment to genuine emotion, aware that moments like this could not be planned or manufactured. When she reached the final section, the music seemed to lift, becoming more playful, and a subtle smile appeared on her face, not for the audience but for the music itself, as if she were enjoying a familiar joke. The last notes faded naturally, without exaggeration, and she let her hands rest for a moment before lowering them, allowing the silence to settle. The reaction that followed was warm and sincere, applause rising not in a sudden burst but as a growing wave, and she stood slowly, bowing politely, her eyes searching for her parents again. Backstage afterward, she spoke softly, answering questions simply, saying that she liked how the piano sounded on that stage and that she hoped the audience felt something nice. There was no sense of victory or defeat in her words, only experience, and as she left the stage area she asked when she could play again. For her, this moment was not an end or a peak, it was another step in a journey that had begun quietly at home by a window, guided by curiosity and feeling rather than ambition. This first part of her story captures the beginning of that journey, the foundation built on listening and imagination, the way a piece of music found a place in a young heart and grew into a performance that touched many. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true, and it shows how even at a very young age, authenticity can speak louder than skill alone, setting the tone for everything that would follow in her life with music. After the second semi-final, life did not suddenly become grand or unfamiliar for her. Instead, it returned to a quieter rhythm that felt comforting after the intensity of the stage. And she went back home carrying the experience inside her rather than talking about it constantly. Her parents noticed that she played differently now, not louder or faster, but with a deeper sense of awareness, as if she had learned something about herself while sitting under the lights, something that could not be explained but could be felt in her hands. She still woke up early, still ate breakfast slowly, still went to school like any other child, yet there was a calm confidence in her posture that had not been there before, a sense that she trusted her inner voice more fully. At school, some classmates knew she had been on television while others did not, and she did not make any effort to explain or show off, answering questions briefly and then returning to her usual games. When asked what it was like to play in front of so many people, she said it felt like playing alone but with many ears listening, a simple description that reflected her experience more accurately than any dramatic explanation could. Teachers noticed her focus during lessons, especially in music class, where she listened carefully to others and offered thoughtful comments that surprised them. She was still playful and sometimes distracted, still laughed easily and cried when tired, reminding everyone that despite the attention, she was still a child growing at her own pace. Her piano teacher adjusted their lessons after the competition, not increasing difficulty too quickly, but encouraging reflection, asking her how certain passages made her feel and why she chose to play them a certain way. The girl responded honestly, sometimes saying she did not know, other times describing images or emotions that guided her fingers, and these conversations became as important as the practice itself. The teacher understood that pushing too hard could break something delicate, and instead focused on nurturing the connection between the child and the instrument, trusting that technique would follow naturally. As invitations and messages began to arrive, requests for interviews or small performances, her parents carefully filtered them, choosing what felt appropriate and safe, always prioritizing her well-being over visibility. They explained each opportunity to her in simple terms, making sure she understood that saying no was always an option, and she appreciated this trust, often deciding based on whether she liked the place or the piano rather than the audience size. When she did agree to play, she approached each setting with the same sincerity she had shown on stage, whether it was a small hall or a quiet studio, sitting at the piano as if it were a familiar friend waiting patiently. One afternoon, while practicing at home, she stopped suddenly and asked her mother why people clapped when she finished playing, wondering if it meant she had done something special or if they were just being kind. Her mother explained that applause was a way of saying thank you, of sharing a feeling, and the girl considered this carefully before nodding, accepting the idea without attaching it to pride. From then on, she began to see performances not as tests but as conversations, moments where she shared something and listened to the response, even if that response was silent attention rather than sound. The music of Amélie Poulain remained close to her, But she slowly explored other pieces too, discovering different moods and colors, sometimes preferring light melodies, other times drawn to slower, deeper sounds. She did not compare them, instead she collected them like stories, each one offering a different way to feel and understand the world. Her parents noticed that she often played after emotionally charged days, using the piano to process feelings she could not yet put into words, and they respected these moments, giving her space without interruption. As time passed, the memory of the semi-final settled into her personal history, no longer vivid and immediate but still influential, shaping her understanding of what music could do beyond the walls of her home. She remembered the faces in the audience, the quiet before she started, the way the piano felt slightly different under her hands, and these memories became part of her internal reference, something she could draw from when feeling unsure. They did not pressure her to repeat the experience, but they showed her that she was capable of stepping into unfamiliar spaces and remaining herself. Her parents also went through their own adjustment, learning how to support a child whose abilities attracted attention without turning those abilities into expectations. They spoke often about balance, about letting her childhood remain full and varied, about protecting her love for music from becoming a burden. They watched her closely for signs of stress, ready to slow down if needed, and found reassurance in her steady demeanor and honest communication. She still asked to stop practicing when tired, still needed reminders to finish homework, still sought comfort when overwhelmed, and these normal needs grounded the family amid unusual circumstances. One evening, during a quiet dinner, she asked if she would always have to play the piano, a question that surprised her parents with its seriousness. They told her that music was a choice, not a rule, that she could change her mind at any time, and she listened carefully before smiling, relieved by the freedom this answer gave her. Later that night, she went to the piano on her own and played softly, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, reaffirming the importance of choice in her relationship with music. As she grew, even slightly, her hands becoming more coordinated, her attention span lengthening, the way she approached learning evolved too, showing more patience, more willingness to revisit difficult sections without frustration. She learned that progress was not always visible immediately, that some days felt harder than others, and that this was part of the process rather than a failure. These lessons extended beyond music, influencing how she approached challenges at school and in daily life, building resilience quietly and steadily. The experience of performing had also introduced her to the idea of audience connection, not as something to seek approval from but as a shared space where emotions met. She began to imagine who might be listening when she played, not specific people but open minds, and this awareness subtly shaped her interpretations. She learned to trust silence, to let notes breathe, to accept imperfections as part of expression, insights that many musicians take years to understand. In conversations with her teacher, the idea of storytelling through music became more central, and she was encouraged to describe the story she heard in each piece before playing it. Sometimes these stories were simple, sometimes complex, but they always guided her phrasing and dynamics naturally. The teacher saw that this approach aligned perfectly with the child's intuitive way of learning, reinforcing strengths rather than imposing rigid structures. As months passed, the world outside continued to show interest. But within her home, life remained intentionally ordinary, filled with routines, family meals, playtime, and rest. This balance allowed her to integrate her experiences without losing herself, to grow not as a performer alone but as a person who happened to play music. The piano stayed where it had always been, by the window, catching the light, a constant presence rather than a symbol of achievement. Part 2 of her story is about settling, about understanding what an extraordinary moment means when placed back into everyday life, about learning that recognition does not have to change identity, and that true growth often happens quietly, away from stages and applause. It shows how a young girl continued her journey not by chasing what had already happened, but by listening closely to herself, allowing experience to deepen her connection to music and to the world around her, setting a steady path forward built on choice, balance, and genuine feeling. As time continued to move forward, the attention around her slowly softened, becoming less immediate and more reflective, and this change allowed her to grow without constant observation. She entered a phase where curiosity began to guide her more strongly than recognition, and she started asking deeper questions about music itself, wondering why certain sounds felt warm while others felt distant, and why some melodies stayed in her mind long after she stopped playing. These questions did not come from ambition, but from a genuine desire to understand the language she was speaking through the piano. Her teacher welcomed this curiosity, encouraging exploration rather than quick answers, allowing her to discover meanings on her own terms. Her daily practice became less structured by adults and more self-directed, with moments where she chose what to play and how long to stay at the piano. Some days she played only for a short time, experimenting with sounds and rhythms, while other days she stayed longer, focused, and absorbed, repeating passages until they felt complete. Her parents trusted this rhythm, understanding that forcing consistency could weaken motivation, and they saw that when she chose to play freely, the quality of her attention improved naturally. Music remained something she stepped into willingly, not something she was pulled toward by expectation. She also began to listen more carefully to others, not only musicians but people in general, noticing tones of voice, pauses, and emotions hidden behind words. This sensitivity had always been part of her nature, but now it became more refined, shaped by her experiences of expressing and receiving emotion through sound. At school, she became a quiet observer, often understanding situations before others reacted, and teachers noticed her empathy when classmates felt upset or excluded. Music had taught her that listening was as important as speaking, a lesson that extended gently into her relationships. New pieces entered her life during this period, introduced gradually by her teacher, who chose music that challenged her emotionally more than technically. Some of these pieces felt heavier, carrying moods she was not immediately comfortable with, and at first she resisted them, saying they felt strange or sad. Instead of pushing her to accept them, her teacher invited her to talk about what she heard, to describe the feelings without judgment, and over time the girl began to see that discomfort could also be meaningful. She learned that music could hold many emotions at once, just like people, and that understanding did not always require liking something immediately. One particular moment marked a quiet shift in her awareness, when she attended a small concert with her parents, sitting among the audience rather than performing. Watching older musicians on stage, she felt a mix of admiration and distance, recognizing that their relationship with music was shaped by years of experience she had not yet lived. She did not feel pressure to catch up or compare herself, but instead felt comforted by the idea that there was time, that music was not a race but a long path with many stages. On the way home, she spoke about how each performer sounded different even when playing the same instrument, noticing individuality rather than hierarchy. Back at home, she began experimenting more with interpretation, changing tempos slightly, emphasizing unexpected notes, testing how different choices affected the feeling of a piece. These experiments were not always successful, and sometimes she stopped mid-phrase dissatisfied, but instead of frustration she showed curiosity, asking why something did not feel right. This reflective approach marked a deeper level of engagement, where mistakes became information rather than failures. Her teacher supported this mindset, praising thoughtful attempts rather than polished results, reinforcing the idea that growth came from awareness. Her parents also noticed changes outside of music, particularly in how she handled challenges. When schoolwork became harder, she approached it with the same patience she used at the piano, breaking tasks into smaller parts, accepting that understanding could take time. When friendships faced minor conflicts, she listened before reacting, often finding calm solutions that surprised adults around her. These qualities were not taught directly but emerged naturally, shaped by the discipline and sensitivity music had nurtured within her. As she grew slightly older, conversations about the future began to surface occasionally, usually initiated by others rather than herself. When asked what she wanted to become, she gave different answers depending on the day, sometimes saying a musician, other times mentioning unrelated dreams, and her parents welcomed this openness. They made it clear that her identity did not need to be fixed, that music could remain part of her life regardless of what path she chose. This reassurance allowed her to explore without fear of disappointing anyone. The memory of the competition remained present but no longer dominant, becoming one chapter among many rather than a defining label. She remembered it fondly, not for the attention but for the feeling of connection it had given her, and sometimes she rewatched a recording quietly, noticing details she had not been aware of before. Instead of judging herself, she observed with interest, recognizing how much she had changed even in a short time. This ability to reflect without self-criticism was rare at her age and spoke to a strong inner balance. Her teacher began introducing the idea of sharing music in smaller community settings, such as playing for friends or family gatherings, environments where the focus was intimacy rather than performance. The girl responded positively, enjoying these moments where she could see listeners up close and feel their reactions directly. These experiences reinforced her understanding of music as communication rather than display, strengthening her confidence in a gentle and sustainable way. Throughout this period, the piano remained a constant presence, not as a symbol of success but as a familiar space where she could explore thoughts and feelings safely. It witnessed moments of joy and confusion, of excitement and calm, adapting to her changing inner world without judgment. The relationship between the child and the instrument deepened quietly, built on trust, choice, and shared time. This third part of her story reflects a phase of internal growth, where the impact of early experiences began to integrate into her character, shaping how she learned, listened, and responded to the world. It shows that true development often happens away from attention, in moments of reflection and exploration, and that for this young girl, music continued to be not a destination but a companion, guiding her gently as she discovered who she was becoming. As another year unfolded, her understanding of music and of herself continued to mature in subtle but meaningful ways, shaped more by experience than instruction. She began to sense when a piece suited her mood and when it did not, learning to choose what to play based on how she felt rather than what was expected. Some days she avoided the piano altogether, choosing instead to draw or read, and her parents respected these choices, seeing them as part of a healthy balance rather than a loss of focus. When she returned to the instrument after these breaks, her playing often felt refreshed, as if distance had given her new perspective. Her teacher noticed that her sense of timing and phrasing had grown more natural, less dependent on counting and more guided by feeling. During lessons, there were moments when the teacher simply listened without interrupting, allowing the music to unfold as it wanted to, and afterward they talked quietly about what had happened. These conversations were thoughtful and calm, centered on awareness rather than correction, and the girl learned to describe what she experienced while playing with increasing clarity. She spoke about tension and release, about moments where she felt unsure and moments where everything seemed to flow, building a vocabulary that connected emotion with sound. Outside of lessons, she began to show interest in how music was created, asking about composers and where melodies came from. She imagined people sitting at pianos long ago, thinking and feeling much like she did, and this idea made her feel connected across time rather than intimidated by history. When her teacher shared simple stories about composers' lives, she listened closely, not focusing on achievement but on the human experiences behind the music. These stories helped her understand that music was shaped by life, and that her own experiences mattered in shaping how she played. At school, her confidence continued to grow quietly, not through leadership roles or loud participation but through consistency and kindness. She was often chosen as a partner for group work because classmates trusted her calm presence, and she learned how to support others without losing her own voice. Music had taught her patience and attentiveness, and these qualities became part of her identity, influencing how she moved through everyday situations. Teachers noted her ability to focus deeply when interested, a skill that carried over into reading, problem-solving, and creative projects. Occasionally, she was invited to play at small events connected to the competition, informal gatherings where former participants shared music in relaxed settings. These events felt different from the stage experience, more like reunions than performances, and she enjoyed seeing familiar faces and hearing how others had grown. There was no sense of rivalry, only shared understanding, and she felt comforted by being among peers who had experienced similar moments of exposure and return. These gatherings reinforced the idea that music could create community without pressure. One evening, while practicing alone, she began to alter a familiar piece, changing notes slightly, experimenting without fear of being wrong. This moment marked the beginning of a new relationship with the piano, one where creation joined interpretation. She was not trying to compose formally, only exploring, following curiosity, and when her parents listened quietly from another room, they heard something uniquely hers emerging. They did not interrupt or praise excessively, understanding that this fragile exploration needed space more than validation. Her emotional awareness also deepened during this time, and she became more reflective, sometimes asking questions about feelings that had no simple answers. Music remained her way of processing these thoughts, offering comfort without explanation, and she learned that not everything needed to be solved immediately. This acceptance of uncertainty was an important part of her growth, allowing her to remain open rather than anxious when faced with new or confusing experiences. As she approached another small milestone in her development, her hands stronger and her attention more sustained, the foundation laid in earlier years showed itself clearly. She did not rush forward or cling to the past, moving instead with a steady curiosity that honored both where she had been and where she was going. The piano continued to be a place of return, a familiar voice in a changing world, and her relationship with it grew not through intensity but through continuity. This part of her journey highlights a period of quiet expansion, where skills deepened alongside self-understanding, and where music remained a trusted companion rather than a destination. It shows how growth can be gentle and unremarkable on the surface while profound beneath, and how a young girl continued to shape her path through listening, choice, and steady presence, preparing her for whatever experiences lay ahead without needing to define them yet. As she moved further along her path, Her relationship with music began to feel more integrated into her sense of self, rather than something separate she did at certain times. The piano was no longer just an instrument she practiced or performed on, but a familiar presence that reflected her inner state with honesty. She could sense when her playing felt rushed or distracted, and when it felt grounded and sincere, and this awareness helped her slow down not only in music but in daily life. She learned to recognize her own limits, choosing rest when needed and focus when energy returned, a balance that many adults struggle to find. Her teacher gradually introduced more structure into lessons, not as pressure but as support, helping her understand form and consistency without losing freedom. The girl responded well to this guidance, appreciating clear boundaries that still left room for expression. She began to understand that discipline did not mean restriction, but rather care for something important, and this realization strengthened her commitment naturally. Practice became more purposeful, with goals that felt meaningful rather than imposed, and she took pride in noticing small improvements that came from patience. At home, music became part of family life in quiet ways, filling evenings with gentle sound rather than formal recitals. Sometimes she played while her parents read or talked softly, and these moments felt especially comforting, as if the piano were weaving itself into ordinary life. She noticed how different pieces changed the atmosphere of a room, how certain melodies invited calm while others stirred energy, and this sensitivity helped her understand the emotional power of sound beyond performance. Music became a shared language within the family, connecting them without the need for constant conversation. Her emotional expression also continued to evolve, becoming clearer and more confident. When she felt upset or confused, she was more likely to speak about it or sit quietly at the piano rather than withdraw completely. This ability to process feelings constructively was noticed by those around her, who saw in her a growing resilience and self-trust. Music had given her a safe place to explore emotion, and over time that safety extended into her interactions with the world. New influences entered her life as well, through listening rather than playing. She became curious about different styles of music, asking to hear pieces she had never encountered before, sometimes reacting with immediate interest and other times with uncertainty. Her parents encouraged this exploration, understanding that taste develops through exposure rather than instruction. She learned that not every piece needed to be understood right away, and that unfamiliar sounds could become meaningful with time and openness. In social settings, she remained gentle and observant, but her confidence allowed her to participate more freely when she chose to. She shared music with friends casually, not as a performance but as something personal, and these moments strengthened her connections. Playing for others in this informal way felt different from the stage, more vulnerable and more real, and she valued this honesty. Music helped her bridge gaps, offering a way to connect that felt natural and sincere. As her skills grew, so did her sense of responsibility toward her own growth. She began to notice when she avoided certain challenges and gently pushed herself to face them, understanding that discomfort was often a sign of learning. This maturity did not come from external pressure, but from internal motivation, a desire to honor the relationship she had built with music. Her teacher supported this shift, offering encouragement while allowing her to lead more of her own development. There were moments of frustration as well, days when progress felt slow or pieces felt difficult. And she learned that these moments were not signs of failure but part of a larger rhythm. She became more patient with herself, taking breaks when needed and returning with renewed focus. This self-compassion was one of the most important skills she developed, shaping how she approached challenges both musical and personal. As this stage of her journey unfolded, it became clear that the early experiences that had once seemed extraordinary were now simply part of her foundation. They no longer defined her but supported her quietly, giving her confidence without expectation. Music continued to grow alongside her, not as a destination to reach but as a space to inhabit, reflecting her evolving understanding of herself and the world. This fifth part of her story captures a time of strengthening and integration, where passion met patience and curiosity found structure. It shows how a young girl continued to develop not by chasing attention or achievement, but by deepening her connection to what mattered, allowing music to shape her character gently and steadily as she moved forward with trust and balance. As she grew a little older, her awareness of time and effort became clearer, and she began to understand that progress was something built slowly through repetition and care rather than sudden moments. She no longer expected pieces to come together quickly, and this patience changed the way she approached learning. When something felt difficult, she stayed with it longer, listening closely to what her hands were doing and how the sound responded, and this quiet persistence became one of her strongest qualities. Music was teaching her how to stay present even when answers did not come immediately. Her teacher noticed that she was beginning to anticipate musical structure on her own, sensing when a phrase needed space and when it needed direction. Instead of being told what to do, she often made thoughtful choices instinctively, guided by listening rather than instruction. Lessons became more like conversations, with moments of shared silence where both listened to the sound settling in the room. These pauses were not empty, they were full of attention and respect for what had just been played, and the girl learned that silence was part of music rather than something to rush through. At home, she started setting small intentions for herself before playing, sometimes deciding to focus on calm, other times on clarity or balance. These intentions were not rules but gentle guides, helping her stay connected to why she was playing in the first place. When she noticed her mind wandering, she stopped and began again without frustration, accepting that focus could be lost and found many times. This kindness toward herself allowed her relationship with the piano to remain healthy and honest. Her parents observed that these habits carried into other areas of her life, especially when facing tasks that required concentration. She approached schoolwork with more confidence, breaking it into manageable parts and trusting herself to work through confusion. When mistakes happened, she no longer reacted with embarrassment but with curiosity, asking what she could learn instead. This shift made challenges feel less threatening and more like opportunities, strengthening her resilience in quiet but lasting ways. She also became more aware of how environments affected her playing, noticing differences between rooms, pianos, and even times of day. Some spaces made her feel open and relaxed, others made her cautious, and she learned to adjust without judgment. This sensitivity helped her prepare for unfamiliar situations, teaching her that adaptation was a skill rather than a weakness. Music showed her that conditions were never perfect, yet expression was always possible. Occasionally, she revisited the piece that had first brought her wider attention, not to measure herself against the past, but to reconnect with a familiar feeling. Each time she played it, something new appeared, a detail she had not noticed before, a color that felt different now. These moments reminded her that growth was not about leaving things behind, but about seeing them with new eyes. The music remained the same, but she was changing, and this realization felt comforting rather than unsettling. Her social world continued to expand gently, and she learned how to share her interests without defining herself by them. When others praised her, she accepted it politely without letting it shape her identity, and when music was not the focus, she was just as content. This balance protected her from feeling trapped by expectations, allowing her to remain flexible and open. She understood that music was part of her life, not the whole of it, and this understanding gave her freedom. There were moments when she chose not to play at all, spending days focused on other interests. And when she returned to the piano, the distance often brought renewed clarity. She learned that stepping away did not weaken her connection but sometimes strengthened it, offering perspective and rest. This trust in cycles of engagement and pause helped her avoid burnout and kept her curiosity alive. As this phase continued, it became clear that music was shaping her inner world as much as her abilities. It taught her how to listen deeply, how to wait, how to respond rather than react, and how to value sincerity over perfection. These lessons settled quietly into her character, influencing how she moved through the world with steadiness and care. This sixth part of her journey reflects a time of deepening awareness, where skills and values grew together without urgency. It shows a young person learning how to remain connected to her passion while staying grounded in herself, allowing music to be a source of understanding rather than pressure, and continuing forward with patience, attention, and trust in her own rhythm. As she continued to grow, her sense of identity became steadier, shaped by experience rather than outside definition, and music settled into her life as something dependable rather than exciting or intimidating. She no longer thought about how others might hear her playing, focusing instead on how it felt inside her body and mind. When she sat at the piano, she listened more deeply, aware of her breathing, the weight of her hands, and the way sound filled the space around her. This awareness made her playing calmer and more intentional, reflecting a maturity that developed naturally over time. Her teacher noticed that she was beginning to take responsibility for her musical direction, arriving at lessons with questions and ideas rather than waiting for instruction. She spoke about pieces she wanted to explore and sounds she was curious about, showing a growing sense of ownership over her learning. Lessons adapted to this shift, becoming more collaborative, with the teacher offering guidance while respecting the girl's instincts. This partnership strengthened her confidence, showing her that her voice mattered and that learning could be shared rather than imposed. At home, music continued to blend into everyday life, sometimes present and sometimes absent without guilt or concern. She played when she felt drawn to it and rested when she needed space, trusting these choices without overthinking them. Her parents supported this rhythm, recognizing that her relationship with music was healthiest when it remained flexible. They listened quietly when she played and stayed silent when she did not, understanding that both states were meaningful. Her emotional world also grew more complex, and she became better at recognizing subtle feelings within herself. Music remained a place where these feelings could exist without explanation, offering comfort when words felt insufficient. She learned that not all emotions needed to be resolved. Some simply needed to be expressed or acknowledged, and the piano allowed her to do this gently. This understanding helped her navigate moments of uncertainty with patience rather than fear. In social situations, she became more confident in sharing who she was without feeling the need to impress. Music sometimes became part of conversations and sometimes did not, and she felt comfortable either way. When she did play for others, it was often informal and spontaneous, moments that felt sincere and connected rather than planned. These experiences reinforced her belief that music was most powerful when it was honest rather than polished. She also began to appreciate listening as much as playing, attending concerts or recordings with focused attention. She noticed details she had once overlooked, the way musicians shaped phrases or allowed silence to speak, and these observations quietly influenced her own playing. Listening became a form of learning that felt effortless, deepening her understanding without pressure. As she reflected on earlier experiences, including the competition that had once seemed so large, she saw them now as meaningful but not defining. They were part of her story but not the whole of it, and this perspective brought peace. She understood that growth did not require constant forward movement, only continued presence and care. This seventh part of her story shows a phase of quiet confidence, where balance replaced intensity and awareness replaced expectation. It reveals how a young girl learned to trust herself more deeply, allowing music to remain a source of connection and understanding rather than obligation, and how this trust shaped her steady movement forward with calm and clarity. As time moved forward, she began to sense a quiet widening inside herself, a feeling that her world was becoming larger not through events, but through understanding, and this change showed itself in the way she approached both music and life. She no longer rushed toward outcomes, and instead stayed with experiences, allowing them to unfold naturally, trusting that meaning would reveal itself in its own time. When she played the piano, she listened not only to the sound, but to how it changed her breathing and posture in this. Awareness made each moment feel complete even when nothing extraordinary happened. Her relationship with effort also shifted during this period. She understood more clearly that effort did not always mean intensity, and that sometimes the most meaningful work happened gently, and without visible struggle. She practiced with more ease, taking breaks when focus faded and returning when attention felt steady. This rhythm helped her avoid frustration and taught her that persistence could be calm and sustainable rather than forceful. Her teacher observed that she had developed a strong internal compass and no longer needed constant feedback to stay oriented. When given a new piece, she explored it patiently, forming her own impressions before asking questions. These questions were thoughtful and specific, showing a deep engagement with the music, rather than a desire for approval. Lessons continued to feel supportive and open, giving her space to grow without pressure. Outside of music, her sense of empathy became more visible. She noticed changes in others and responded with quiet kindness, offering help or listening without needing recognition. These qualities made her presence comforting to those around her, and she began to understand that attentiveness was a strength that connected many parts of her life. Music had shaped this sensitivity, but it now extended far beyond the piano. She also became more comfortable with uncertainty, accepting that not everything needed to be decided or understood immediately. When faced with choices, she took time to feel rather than react, and this patience helped her make decisions that felt true rather than rushed. This approach brought her a sense of stability and allowed her to move forward without anxiety. Occasionally, she returned to moments from her earlier years, not with nostalgia, but with appreciation. She saw how each stage had contributed something valuable, and how nothing had been wasted. Even moments of confusion or hesitation now felt meaningful, because they had taught her how to listen and wait. This perspective gave her confidence in the unfolding of her own path. Music continued to accompany her quietly, sometimes at the center of her attention, and sometimes in the background, always available and never demanding. She trusted this presence, knowing that it would remain part of her life in whatever form felt right. This trust allowed her to stay open to change without fear of loss. This eighth part of her story reflects a time of widening awareness and inner steadiness. It shows how she learned to move with life rather than against it, allowing music to support her growth without defining it, and how this balance gave her the freedom to continue forward with openness, patience, and quiet strength. As her story continued into this next phase, everything that had once felt separate now came together, quietly forming a sense of wholeness that guided her without effort. She no longer thought of her journey in terms of beginnings or milestones, because each day felt connected to the last through understanding rather than memory. Music remained present, not as a goal to reach or a role to fulfill, but as a steady language she carried within herself wherever she went. When she sat at the piano, she did so with ease and trust, allowing sound to emerge without planning or judgment. Her playing reflected who she was in that moment, sometimes gentle, sometimes curious, sometimes still. And she accepted each expression without comparison. This acceptance marked the deepest growth of all, because it showed that she no longer needed to prove anything through music she played, because it felt true, and that truth was enough. Her life beyond music also reflected this balance. She moved through her days with attentiveness, noticing small details, and responding with care. She understood her own needs more clearly and respected them without guilt. This self-respect allowed her to remain open to others, offering presence rather than performance in her relationships. People around her sensed this steadiness and felt comfortable in her company because she brought calm without trying to create it. Looking back on the moment when she first played on a large stage, she saw it now not as a defining event, but as a reflection of who she had already been, even then a child, listening deeply, trusting her feelings, and expressing them honestly. That same essence continued to guide her forward, unchanged by time or attention. The stage had simply revealed what was already there. She did not need to decide what music would become in her future, because she trusted the connection completely. Whether it remained central or quietly supportive, she knew it would stay with her. As long as she listened, this trust gave her freedom to grow in many directions without fear of losing herself. This final part of her story is not an ending, but a settling. It shows how a young girl grew into herself through patience, listening, and care, allowing music to shape her without defining her, and learning that the most meaningful journeys do not rush forward, but unfold naturally, carried by presence, balance, and quiet confidence.